What if I told you that the Roman Empire, the greatest superpower of the ancient world, wasn't built only by legions and emperors, but by farmers counting coins, merchants risking storms, slaves working in silence, and taxpayers who probably cursed the state just like we do today? Who really paid for the Roman Empire? Who financed the roads, the armies, the Colosseum, the grain doles, the wars in Gaul, the palaces in Constantinople? And more importantly, how did Rome keep the money flowing for more than 1,000 years? Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, from the mythical foundation of the city to the rise of the Byzantine Empire, you'll understand not just how Rome conquered the world, but how it paid for it. And you might start seeing modern economies in a very uncomfortable new light. To understand who paid for the empire, we have to start before there was an empire at all, before marble, before Caesars, before global trade networks, just a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber River, traditionally founded in 753 BC. Back then, Rome wasn't a financial superpower. It was a fragile city surrounded by rivals. In the so-called monarchical period, Rome was ruled by kings. The economy was simple, almost primitive by later standards. Wealth meant land. Power meant livestock. There was no complex taxation system yet, no imperial treasury overflowing with silver. The early Roman state relied on tribute from conquered neighbors, agricultural production from citizen farmers, and occasional spoils of war. War, from the beginning, was not just about survival, it was about resources: cattle, land, slaves. In these early centuries, the Roman economy was essentially agrarian and redistributive. The king and elite families controlled land, the people farmed it, war redistributed wealth. No legions marching across continents yet, just survival economics. Then comes the Republic, and everything changes. After the last king was expelled around 509 BC, Rome didn't just reinvent its political system, it slowly reinvented its economy. Expansion became systematic, conquest became policy. And here's the key. In the early Republic, Rome didn't need heavy taxation at home because war paid the bills. Victorious generals brought back treasure, slaves, gold, silver, art, and entire territories that would later generate revenue. According to scholars like Adrian Goldsworthy and Mary Beard, conquest was not a side effect of Roman politics, it was deeply embedded in its economic engine. When Rome defeated a rival, it didn't just celebrate, it imposed indemnities, it seized land, it established provinces, and those provinces paid tribute. This tribute, often in the form of grain, metals, or money, flowed back to Rome. In many cases, Roman citizens in Italy were lightly taxed or not taxed at all because the provinces were footing the bill. But here's where it gets interesting. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, it developed something revolutionary for its time: a provincial taxation system. Local elites in conquered territories were often left in place, but they were now responsible for collecting taxes on behalf of Rome. Sometimes private tax contractors, publicani, bid for the right to collect taxes in a province. They paid Rome upfront, then squeezed the population to make a profit. It was efficient, it was profitable, it was also brutal. Cicero himself complained about abuses in the provinces. Imagine being a farmer in Asia Minor or Sicily. You're not just paying local obligations, you're paying Rome, and Rome expects its money. Meanwhile, back in Italy, something else is happening. The influx of slaves from conquest transforms the economy. Massive estates, latifundia, expand. Small farmers struggle to compete. Land concentrates in the hands of elites. The Roman Republic becomes wealthier, but also more unequal. Who's paying for Rome now? Increasingly, it's the provinces. It's the conquered. It's the enslaved labor force generating agricultural surplus. It's the silver mines of Spain. It's the grain fields of North Africa. The Roman state becomes less dependent on direct taxation of its Italian citizens and more dependent on imperial extraction. Empire finances itself through empire. But conquest has limits, and by the late Republic, the costs of expansion start rising. Armies are larger, campaigns are longer, civil wars erupt. When generals like Julius Caesar march on Rome, they aren't just fighting for power, they're fighting over control of enormous financial networks. Caesar's conquest of Gaul wasn't just a military triumph, it was an economic windfall. Gold, slaves, tribute. War financed ambition. Ambition reshaped the state. Then comes the Principate, the age of Augustus, and here the Roman economy enters a new phase. The empire is vast, conquest slows, stability becomes the priority. Augustus understands something critical. You can't rely forever on plunder. You need structure. So he professionalizes taxation. He reorganizes provincial administration. He establishes a standing army with fixed salaries, and that means predictable expenses. Soldiers must be paid regularly. Veterans must receive pensions or land. This requires a reliable revenue stream. Under the Principate, the Roman Empire develops a more sophisticated fiscal system. There are land taxes, poll taxes, customs duties, inheritance taxes. Provinces pay according to assessed wealth and productivity. Egypt, for example, becomes a critical grain supplier. North Africa feeds Rome. Spain produces metals. Trade flourishes across the Mediterranean. Roman roads, ports, and legal systems reduce transaction costs. The Mediterranean becomes, in a sense, an internal Roman lake, Mare Nostrum. Commerce expands, and with commerce comes tax revenue. But here's the nuance. The Roman state was still relatively small compared to modern governments. As historians like Peter Garnsey and Greg Wolfe point out, the imperial administration was surprisingly lean. There wasn't a massive bureaucracy micromanaging every village. Local elites did much of the administrative work. Cities collected taxes. Local aristocrats served as intermediaries. Rome governed through networks, not through endless officials. That made the system efficient, but also fragile. The army, however, remained the single greatest expense. Maintaining hundreds of thousands of soldiers along frontiers stretching from Britain to Syria required enormous funding. Pay, equipment, fortifications, logistics. If revenue faltered, the consequences were immediate. Soldiers were not patient creditors. And so we arrive at a turning point. In the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire enters crisis. Political instability, plagues, economic contraction, external invasions. And here's the brutal truth. The old model of financing the empire through stable taxation and limited expansion starts to crack. Emperors face constant military threats and internal revolts. Armies need higher pay to remain loyal, but revenue isn't keeping up. So what does the state do? It debases the currency. Roman silver coins gradually contain less silver and more base metal. Inflation rises. Trust in currency declines. Trade suffers. Taxation increasingly shifts from monetary payments to payments in kind, grain, animals, supplies directly for the army. The economy becomes more rigid. Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century, attempts sweeping reforms. He restructures the empire administratively. He increases the number of provinces. He imposes more systematic taxation assessments. He even issues the famous Edict on Maximum Prices in an attempt to curb inflation. It fails. You can't legislate away structural imbalance. Under Diocletian and Constantine, taxation becomes heavier and more direct. The state now demands detailed records of land and population. Farmers are increasingly tied to their land to ensure tax stability. Economic mobility narrows. The empire becomes more bureaucratic, more controlling. The cost of survival in a dangerous world is higher state intervention. And then comes the division. The Western Roman Empire weakens under mounting pressure. Tax bases shrink as territories are lost. Fewer taxpayers, same military threats. Eventually, in 476 AD, the Western Empire collapses. But the eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, survives. And here's the twist. It survives because it manages its economy better. Constantinople sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Trade routes flourish. The Byzantine state maintains a relatively stable gold currency, the solidus, for centuries. That stability builds trust. The The tax system remains rigorous but effective. Land taxes, trade duties, state monopolies on certain goods like silk. The Byzantine Empire invests in infrastructure, fortifications, and bureaucracy. It becomes a highly organized fiscal machine. As historian Chris Wickham argues, the survival of Byzantium was deeply tied to its fiscal resilience. It could still collect taxes. It could still pay armies. It could still fund diplomacy, sometimes buying off enemies instead of fighting them. So who paid for the Roman Empire across all these centuries? The answer shifts over time. In the early days, it was citizen farmers and conquered neighbors. In the Republic, it was increasingly the provinces and the spoils of war. In the Principate, it was a structured imperial tax system supported by trade and agriculture. In the late Empire, it was a heavily taxed population under growing bureaucratic pressure. And in Byzantium, it was a disciplined fiscal state, balancing taxation and commerce. But here are the key moments, the turning points where economics shaped destiny. The shift from conquest-financed expansion to taxation-financed stability under Augustus. The debasement crisis of the 3rd century. Diocletian's reforms, which saved the empire in the short term but transformed its economic character. The survival of the Eastern Empire through monetary stability. These were not just administrative changes, they determined whether armies marched or mutinied, whether cities thrived or starved. And we can't ignore the human impact. Behind every tax assessment was a farmer calculating whether he could survive the year. Behind every military payroll was a soldier deciding loyalty. Behind every grain shipment to Rome was a provincial labor force working under obligation. The empire's glory, the Colosseum, the roads, the aqueducts, was built on a vast web of extraction, redistribution, and labor. Rome's economy was not modern capitalism, it was not a welfare state, it was a pre-industrial imperial system built on land, conquest, taxation, slavery, and trade. Brutally efficient, deeply unequal, occasionally brilliant. In the end, the Roman economic story is not just about coins and taxes, it's about sustainability. Rome thrived when revenue matched ambition. It faltered when costs outpaced income. Sound familiar? Every empire faces that equation: military commitments, administrative overhead, public expectations, revenue limits. When the balance tips too far, even the mightiest power cracks. And here's the legacy. Modern taxation systems, public finance structures, state-managed currencies, infrastructure investment, many trace conceptual roots back to Roman experimentation. Rome showed the world that empire is not just about conquest. It's about accounting, about logistics, about ensuring that the roads are maintained, the soldiers paid, the grain delivered. Without economic foundation, even the greatest army collapses. But here's the question I want to leave you with. If Rome ultimately fell in the West because its fiscal base eroded while its military costs remained high, what does that teach us about modern superpowers stretched across the globe? Is economic resilience the true measure of strength? And what happens when expansion outpaces sustainability? In our next deep dive, we could explore the Roman military machine itself, how it was organized, supplied, and transformed from citizen militia to professional war engine. Or perhaps we should investigate the daily life of a Roman taxpayer in the provinces. Let me know in the comments which path you want to take. If you found this exploration of the Roman Empire's economy insightful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Share it with someone who loves history or someone who thinks taxes are a modern invention. And drop your thoughts below. Who do you think really paid for Rome? The elites? The provinces? The soldiers? Let's talk about it. See you next video.